We'll begin with Kant's account of beauty, judgments of taste, the agreeable, and the good. At the beginning of the analytic of the beautiful, Kant distinguishes aesthetic judgments from cognitive judgments. Cognitive judgments, like this flower is yellow, attribute properties to objects by classifying things under concepts of the understanding. Aesthetic judgments, by contrast, do not relate objects to concepts of the understanding, but are rather grounded in our feelings of pleasure and displeasure. Kant describes the difference between cognitive and aesthetic judgments by claiming that the determining ground for the former is objective, while the ground for the latter is subjective. Cognitive judgments are based on properties of objects, while aesthetic judgments are based on feelings in the subject. Judgments of taste, which we will be focusing on, are one kind of aesthetic judgment in which we judge things to be beautiful or not beautiful. However, to fully understand judgments of taste, it helps to compare them to other kinds of judgments. Kant immediately distinguishes judgments of taste from another kind of aesthetic judgment, judgments of the agreeable. As an aesthetic judgment, judgments of the agreeable are based on feelings of pleasure and displeasure in the subject rather than properties in the object. In making a judgment of the agreeable, we say that we enjoy something, as when I say, I like chocolate. However, judgments of the agreeable are distinct from judgments of taste in two ways. First, judgments of the agreeable are interested. Kant describes this interest in the agreeable as a satisfaction we take in the representation of the existence of the agreeable object, as when I take satisfaction in the taste of chocolate in my mouth. This satisfaction is connected to my desire for the object, so we say the judgments of the agreeable gratify us rather than merely pleasing us. Second, in making a judgment of the agreeable, I do not claim that others ought to make the same judgment. For instance, when I say, I like chocolate, and my friend says, I do not like chocolate, I do not feel that he must be wrong, and I do not try to convince him that he does in fact like chocolate. Judgments of the agreeable make no claim to universality. Kant also distinguishes judgments of taste from judgments of the good, which also judge objects that please us. Like judgments of the agreeable, but unlike judgments of beauty, I take an interest in objects I judge to be good. I am satisfied when I represent the existence of what is good because I have a rational desire for the good, and the good object can be said to gratify me rather than merely pleasing me. However, judgments of the agreeable are distinct from judgments of the good, which is why I may judge the chocolate in my mouth agreeable but not good, as when I realize that eating it will give me a stomachache. Unlike both judgments of the agreeable and judgments of taste, which are aesthetic judgments, judgments of the good are cognitive judgments. While I do take pleasure in the good, this feeling of pleasure is not the ground of my judgment. I may judge something to be good because it is a means to some end, as when I judge something to be useful for a task. Or I may judge something to be good because it is itself an end, as when I judge my goal to be good. In both cases, my judgment is grounded in the concept of some end, and this grounding in a concept of the understanding makes judgments of the good cognitive rather than aesthetic. The difference is most clear when we consider how we would defend our judgments of the good. When I say it is good to read Kant, I can give a determinate answer to the question why. I can say, for instance, we can learn a lot from Kant, giving a justification in terms of the end, the learning. By contrast, when someone asks me, why do you like chocolate, I might be tempted to respond, I don't know, I just do. Because judgments of the good are cognitive judgments, I can appeal to some concept to ground my judgment, like the concept of an end. In the case of aesthetic judgments, however, my judgment is grounded in a feeling of pleasure, and I cannot appeal to some deeper conceptual reason for my judgment. Whether I judge something to be good in itself or a means to something good in itself, judgments of the good implicitly claim that others ought to agree. In this way, judgments of the good demand universal agreement, and we feel compelled to argue with those who disagree with our judgments of goodness. This marks a contrast with judgments of the agreeable, which do not demand universality and are not worth arguing for. However, Kant will suggest that judgments of taste, like judgments of goodness, do lay claim to universality. We can thus distinguish judgments of the agreeable, judgments of the beautiful, and judgments of the good as follows, provided in this chart. This distinction between judgments of the agreeable and judgments of the good is important for understanding Kant's most significant innovation, theorizing judgments of taste. Kant distinguishes his view from empiricism of taste and rationalism of taste, which were held in his own time. As he understands these views, empiricism of taste conflates judgments of taste with judgments of the agreeable, while rationalism of taste conflates judgments of taste with judgments of the good. Against the empiricists of taste, Kant agrees with the rationalists that judgments of taste are universal. However, Kant sides with the empiricists against the rationalists of taste in claiming that judgments of taste are aesthetic rather than cognitive, ultimately grounded in our subjective feeling of pleasure. 2. Beauty and disinterested contemplation. Kant's theory of beauty is original insofar as judgments of beauty are both subjective, i.e. non-cognitive, and lay claim to universality. As an aesthetic judgment, judgments of beauty are not grounded in concepts applied to the object judged beautiful, but in a feeling in the subject. In this regard, they are non-cognitive. or as Kant sometimes said, subjective. But Kant goes on to claim that they differ from judgments of the agreeable in a way other than their universality. While the satisfaction we get from agreeable objects is interested, the pleasure we derive from beautiful objects is disinterested. In other words, when I make a judgment of beauty, I make no claim about the desirability of what I judge. The object need not be gratified. As an example, Kant suggests that he may judge a palace beautiful, though he does not care for the extravagance of it, which is made merely to be gaped at, and if he were on an uninhabited island and could conjure up such a magnificent structure through mere wish, he would not even take the trouble of doing so if he already had a hut that was comfortable enough for him. The point is not that we should not desire the existence of a beautiful object. In many cases, we do desire the existence of beautiful objects in nature and art. Rather, the point is that whatever pleasure we get from the existence of a beautiful object is entirely independent of the pleasure we get from its beauty. This is to be contrasted with judgments of the good and judgments of the agreeable. I take pleasure in the good because I rationally desire the attainment of my end. My pleasure is bound up with my rational desire to bring into existence the state of affairs in which my end is realized. Similarly, what is agreeable is pleasurable insofar as it satisfies my immediate sensible desires, the desires Kant claims animals have. I may imagine the taste of chocolate when I do not have any in the apartment. When I do, I remain ungratified and do not experience the kind of pleasure that grounds judgments of the agreeable. In fact, the more clearly I imagine the taste of chocolate, the more tormented I am by the fact that I do not have it. The interested pleasure involved in judgments of the agreeable fosters an acquisitive attitude towards what is found agreeable. This acquisitive attitude is entirely out of place in judgments of beauty. Whatever pleasure we may have in acquiring the Venus de Milo is completely independent of the pleasure we derive from contemplating its beauty. Insofar as we take a disinterested pleasure in the Venus de Milo, the kind of pleasure that grounds a judgment of beauty, it does not matter if the image we are contemplating is real or imaginary. Kant described this by saying, the judgment of taste is merely contemplated, as we take pleasure in the object independently of its existence. When it comes to disinterested pleasure, mere contemplation of the object in the imagination should give us just as much pleasure as an equally vivid experience of the real thing. The same does not hold for the interested pleasure we take in chocolate. 3. Beauty and the demand for universality. Kant suggests that the disinterestedness of judgments of beauty is deeply connected to their universality. As he writes, when a person reflects on his experience of disinterested pleasure, he cannot discover as grounds of the satisfaction any private conditions pertaining to his subject alone, and must therefore regard it as grounded in those that he can also presuppose in everyone else. Consequently, he must believe himself to have grounds for expecting a similar pleasure of everyone. In other words, because we cannot find any ground for a judgment of pleasure in the beautiful that is unique to us, our reflection on the pleasure leads us to expect that all other subjects should experience the same pleasure in our circumstance. As Kant puts it, we see this pleasure as arising from a common sense we all share, where common sense is not understood in the ordinary sense, but rather as a shared propensity for feelings of disinterested pleasure. While this ground of our expectation that others ought to agree with our this is the ground of our expectations that others ought to agree with our judgments of pleasure. While judgments of the agreeable are also grounded in pleasure, reflection on that pleasure reveals grounds for the satisfaction that we cannot expect others to share, such as the tremendous craving for chocolate. Judgments of the agreeable, unlike judgments of the beautiful, are bound up with our particular, what Kant called heteronymous, desires, which is why our pleasure in the agreeable is interested rather than disinterested. Disinterested pleasure, stripped of grounding these particular desires, is properly autonomous, and this is the ground of their universality. We should clarify Kant's claim that our judgments of beauty claim universality by distinguishing it from the claim that others will, as a matter of fact, agree with our judgments of beauty. When we make a judgment of beauty, we do not make some sort of empirical prediction about the aesthetic sensibilities of the majority of people. Disagreement, even strenuous disagreement from the majority of people, does not give us reason to abandon our judgments of beauty. As Kant puts the point, a young poet does not let himself be dissuaded from his conviction that his poem is beautiful by the judgment of the public, nor that of his friends, because taste makes claim merely to autonomy. To make the judgments of others into the determining ground of one's own would be heteronomy. The universality of judgments of beauty is not a prediction, but a demand. When the young poet claims his poem is beautiful, he does not claim that most people will agree with his judgment, but rather that most people ought to. He feels that others ought to agree because he sees no heteronymous desires grounding his feeling of pleasure, and thus takes his pleasure to be grounded in universal features of his subjectivity that all others share. The poet makes the judgment of beauty as an autonomous universal subject, and this would not be the case if the judgment of beauty was grounded in a desire for approval from the crowd. Such a desire would be heteronymous, not autonomous. Elsewhere, Kant puts this point by claiming that when one calls the object beautiful, one believes oneself to have a universal voice. Thus, when a person makes a true judgment of beauty, she demands universality, even if most people disagree with her. For Kant, then, there is a space between what is objective and what is relative to the particular subject. Judgments of beauty occupy the domain of subjective universality, where we demand intersubjective agreement on something that is not objective. This is an easy point to miss, as Kant points out. Because we take judgments of beauty to have universality, like judgments of the good, Kant claims that we speak of the beautiful as if beauty were a property of the object, and the judgment constitutes a cognition of the object through concept of it, although it is only aesthetic, because its validity for everyone can be presupposed. While judgments of beauty are aesthetic rather than cognitive, they are more like cognitive judgments than judgments of the agreeable, insofar as we presuppose their universality. As a result of this similarity, we are tempted to treat judgments of beauty as cognitive judgments and to treat beauty as a property of the object judged beautiful that grounds our judgment. To see this, we can note that we ordinarily come to the judgment, 1, this flower is beautiful, is the same kind of judgment as 2, this flower is beautiful, it's yellow, and that both are very different from the judgments 3, I like the smell of this flower. But for Kant, judgments 1 and 3 are both aesthetic judgments, one of beauty and the other of the agreeable, while only 2 is a cognitive judgment. However, because we demand intersubjective agreement on our subjective aesthetic judgments that this flower is beautiful, just as we demand intersubjective agreement on our objective cognitive judgment that this flower is yellow, we tend to conflate judgments of beauty with cognitive judgments and treat beauty as a property of objects like yellow. 4. Beauty and the lack of a principle of taste. But what is wrong with treating beauty as a property of the flower, like yellow, when we demand universal agreement on both the flower's yellowness and its beauty? Kant considers this worry when he writes, "Now what should one infer from this demand for universal assent, except that the beauty must be held to be a property of the flower itself? And yet, this is not how it is. While we may be tempted to claim that the feeling of pleasure that we take as universally valid is grounded in an objective property of the flower, beauty, Kant suggests that this universality cannot originate from concepts, for there is no transition from concepts to the feeling of disinterested pleasure or displeasure. Kant clarifies what he means when he claims that it is absolutely impossible for us to find a principle of taste, understood as a fundamental proposition under the condition of which one could subsume the concept of an object and then by means of an inference conclude that it is beautiful. In other words, there is no list of properties an object could have that would be sufficient to establish its beauty. 2 people could agree on all the empirical properties of a flower. This would not settle the question of its beauty one way or another. The concept of beauty is not analyzable in terms of simpler concepts, even traditionally appealed to aesthetic concepts like symmetry, unity, and simplicity. This is not to say that we do not use these aesthetic concepts as guidelines in certain styles of art. Surely we do. Even then, however, the finished product is not just beautiful because it exhibits a certain set of those properties. Rather, we created the object with those properties because we have taken disinterested pleasure in such objects in the past. Judgments of beauty involve an essential reference to feeling, and thus take place on a wholly different level than that which empirical science describes. As Kant puts it, there is no science of the beautiful. Kant gives a reason for this view when he says, I must be sensitive to the pleasure immediately in the representation of it, and I cannot be talked into it by means of proofs, because one wants to submit the object to his own eyes. We can perhaps understand Kant's claim best through a thought experiment. Suppose I have never been to Versailles and never seen a picture of it, but I receive a letter from my friend who is visiting it. My friend writes that Versailles is beautiful and speaks to describe everything she saw accurately in extensive detail. Kant suggests that no matter how much detail my friend includes, I will not be in a position to make a judgment of beauty concerning Versailles. I will, of course, be able to make a number of other related judgments, depending on what information she includes. I may be able to judge that my friend judges Versailles beautiful, that my friend thinks I ought to judge it beautiful if I ever see it, that most people judge Versailles beautiful, that the letter itself is beautiful, and that, given my friend's good taste, I am likely to find Versailles beautiful. But all of these are cognitive judgments. They do not get me all the way to a proper aesthetic judgment of taste. For me to judge Versailles beautiful, I must see Versailles myself and take disinterested pleasure in it firsthand. This makes judgments of beauty unlike any cognitive judgments, which I can make on the basis of an accurate third-person description. It also makes beauty a different kind of property than ordinary empirical properties, as it is disconnected from other properties that can be included in objective descriptions of an object. On this basis, Kant claims the judgment, the flower is beautiful, really is of a different kind than the judgment, the flower is yellow. 5. Beauty and conceptual thought. Since judgments of beauty are aesthetic rather than cognitive, they are grounded in a subjective feeling of pleasure rather than a concept on which the object judged beautiful falls under. Kant described this by saying, that is beautiful which pleases universally without a concept. We should not read this claim in a radical way, where the feeling of pleasure requires us to bracket all conceptual thought. Kant gives us examples of us judging flowers, hummingbirds, and fantasias to be beautiful, which requires us to have enough conceptual thought in conjunction with our feeling of pleasure to connect this feeling of pleasure to these determinate objects. Presumably, then, Kant is not suggesting that when I feel disinterested pleasure from looking at a painting, I bracket all my beliefs about what is depicted in the painting, so I truly feel this pleasure without a concept. Rather, there are two ways in which concepts cannot play a role in our judgments of beauty. First, concepts cannot be the evidential ground for our judgments of beauty. As we already saw, there are no principles of taste we can use to prove an object is beautiful, and the ground of our judgment of beauty is always a feeling of disinterested pleasure. But second, falling under a concept cannot be the cause of our feelings of pleasure, because this would conflate judgments of beauty with judgments of the good. Judgments of goodness are the judgments grounded in a pleasure caused by an object falling under a certain category. We take pleasure in the objects falling under these categories because this helps us achieve some end or realize that end. All of this, however, is compatible with conceptual thought accompanying our feeling of pleasure. And we may even think that this is essential if we are ever to make a judgment of beauty about some object on the basis of this feeling of pleasure. Beauty, free play, and purposiveness. Given all of the preceding, there are still big questions Kant needs to address. First, given Kant's view that disinterested pleasure is not caused the fact that the object is beautiful falls under certain concepts, what is it caused by? Second, if this feeling of pleasure is supposed to be the ground of judgments of beauty, how do we distinguish it from the pleasure we derive from an object's agreeableness? In a difficult passage, Kant suggests that the disinterested pleasure is caused by a universally communicable mental state. This distinguishes disinterested pleasure from the pleasure we get from the agreeable, since that is based on our particular sensory modalities and cannot be communicated to those who lack them. The agreeableness of chocolate cannot be communicated to one who lacks taste buds. Kant calls the universally communicable mental state grounding judgments of beauty the harmony of the faculties of cognition and free play, and suggests that it is the ground of this disinterested pleasure. We will attempt to parse what he means by this. The free play of the faculties of cognition concerns the relationship between the imagination and the understanding. As Kant writes, now there belongs to a representation by which an object is given, in order for there to be a cognition of it in general, imagination for the composition of the manifold of intuition, and understanding for the unity of the concept that unifies the representations. While the imagination is the faculty that traffics in sensible intuitions and represents particulars, the understanding traffics in abstract concepts and represents universals. By conceptualizing the world we perceive, the understanding imposes a unity on it. However, Kant sees the relationship between the imagination and understanding as problematic. In a lecture from the same time period as the Third Critique, the early 1790s, Kant anthropomorphizes the faculties, claiming imagination and understanding are two friends who cannot do without one another, but cannot stand one another either, for one always harms the other. The more universal the understanding and its rules, the more perfect it is. But if one wants to consider things in concreto, then it absolutely cannot do without the imagination. In their normal functioning, the imagination and the understanding work in conflict with one another, the former representing the concrete and the latter abstracting away from it. The harmony of the two faculties in free play is presumably meant to overcome the harm the faculties normally inflict on one another. While much of what Kant says about the harmonious free play of the imagination and the understanding remains obscure, perhaps Kant's clearest summary is, now since no concept of the object is here the ground of the judgment, the subjective condition of all judgments can consist only in the subsumption of the imagination itself, under the condition that the understanding in general advance from intuitions to concepts. Taste, as a subjective power of judgment, contains a principle of subsumption, not of intuition under concepts, but of the faculty of intuitions or presentations, i.e. of the imagination, under the faculty of concepts, the understanding, insofar as the former in its freedom is in harmony with the latter in its lawfulness. This image of the imagination, free from any determinate concept, harmonizing with lawful understanding that conceptualizes the manifold of sensible intuition, is the primary picture we get of the harmony of the faculties. While the understanding is rule-governed in its concept application, the imagination is rule-governed insofar as it is subsumed under the understanding, even though it is not subject to any particular rule in its harmonious free play. Elsewhere, Kant describes this as lawfulness without law, insofar as something is lawful but does not issue a determinate cognition. Allison gives the harmonious free play at least a plausible reading when he writes, presumably, the imagination in its free play stimulates the understanding by occasioning it to engender fresh conceptual possibilities, while conversely, the imagination, under the general direction of the understanding, strives to conceive new patterns of order. We can perhaps understand this if we take the lack of the determinate cognition structuring the imagination to be compatible with the multitude of indeterminate cognitions that the imagination can jump between. For instance, when we read a good metaphor in a poem, we do not feel restricted to a particular way of conceptualizing it. We can play with a number of different ways of conceptualizing it. Insofar as these are all structured by the understanding, this is lawful, but insofar as we are not confined to one interpretation, the understanding does not supply a law. This, we may think, leaves room for free play. If the metaphor is beautiful, harmonious free play. However, if we read the harmonious free play of the faculties, Kant suggests that it founds the feeling of disinterested pleasure that in turn grounds our judgment of beauty. He further characterizes this disinterested pleasure by claiming that it is identical to our consciousness of the merely formal purposiveness to which an object is given. Purposiveness, Kant explains, is a quality of an object has when it appears to have a purpose. Insofar as we represent something as having a determinate purpose, we need to relate it to a concept of an end, as we do in the judgment of the good. Kant calls this objective purposiveness. But we can represent something as purposes, i.e. as if it had a purpose, without actually representing a determinate purpose for it. This, Kant claims, is how we represent an object we ultimately judge to be beautiful. We represent the very form of purposiveness without representing its actual purpose. Kant's account of formal purposiveness sheds a bit more light on the harmonious free play of the faculties, insofar as he describes representations of formal purposiveness as the agreement of the manifold of a unity, leaving undetermined what it is supposed to be. Since Kant goes on to say that our representation of formal purposiveness is the disinterested pleasure itself, this agreement of the manifold of the imagination with some indeterminate conceptual unity must be the harmonious free play of the faculty that gives rise to our representation of formal purposiveness / disinterested pleasure. 7. Genius, aesthetic ideas, and creation of beauty. In addition to explaining how judgments of beauty are possible, Kant tries to explain how beauty is brought into the world. He does this by developing an account of genius, which he defines as the talent, natural gift that gives the rule to art. Kant tells us that beautiful arts must necessarily be considered as arts of geniuses. The basic idea is that the various arts presuppose rules that determine the trajectory of the field. However, given Kant's argument that there are no rules grounded in concepts that determine whether or not an object is beautiful, the rules that govern the field of the beautiful arts cannot be formulated conceptually. As a result, those creating beautiful art cannot consciously think of the rules they are following, because they lack the concepts to express these rules. Thus, Kant suggests the rules governing the beautiful arts must be inborn predispositions of the artist that he can never be consciously aware of, and that artists are in possession of these predispositions, or geniuses. Kant tries to derive a number of consequences from this account. Since the genius does not follow determinate rules that can be formulated conceptually, the rules he follows cannot be taught or learned. Because the rules the genius follows could not have been learned from someone else, his work will be characterized by originality. Thus, all knowledge that could have been learned by imitation cannot be indicative of genius. It is essential that genius cannot be learned. However, the works of genius are themselves seen as exemplars to be imitated. In this way, genius gives the role to beautiful art. These rules remain unformulated because they are not conceptual. Rather, they are certain patterns of imitation, where what is imitated is always a concrete, particular work of art, not just a set of concepts the work of art falls under. Further, because genius can emerge on the scene at any time and flood the world of beautiful art with new original contributions, the rules of art can go in unpredictable directions. As Kant tries to develop the qualities of genius further, he introduces the notion of aesthetic ideas. Kant points to examples of aesthetic judgments where something is not beautiful, but we cannot find anything specific to criticize. For instance, when a poem is pretty and elegant, or a story accurate and well organized, but not beautiful. In such cases, Kant points to our tendency to say that the work of art is without spirit, and asks what we mean by this. He suggests that spirit is a principle of the mind that animates the harmonious free play of the faculties, so when this is lacking in an encounter with the work of art, we do not judge it beautiful. Further, he identifies spirit with a faculty in the mind that exhibits aesthetic ideas, which he defines as that representation of the imagination that occasions much thinking, though without it being possible for any determinate thought, i.e. concept, to be adequate to it, which, consequently, no language fully attains or can make intelligible. Kant compares these aesthetic ideas to the ideas of reason from the first critique, like God, the soul, and the world of the totality, which he now calls concepts to which no intuition can be adequate. In this way, there is a symmetry between ideas of reason, where the understanding has a concept that is too big for any intuition, and aesthetic ideas, where the imagination has an intuition that is too big for any concept. To further the parallel, like the ideas of reason, aesthetic ideas exhibit what lies beyond the bounds of experience, such as creation, eternity, and death. These aesthetic ideas fill the imagination with images that stimulate the understanding into frantic thought, where the understanding never can be edited down. With this doctrine, Kant claims that the genius brings beauty into the world through the expression of aesthetic ideas, and thus requires an imagination that is free to provide unsought, extensive, undeveloped material for the understanding, which it applies subjectively for the animation of the cognitive powers. Kant goes on to say that genius is gifted with the ability to express what is unnameable in the mental state in the case of a certain representation, and to make it universally communicable. Genius, then, spurs on the activity of the understanding, and drives it towards the creation of new concepts through an imaginative act. When genius is clearly displayed in a work of art, Kant tells us, the imagination of the artist shines through it, and we call the art inspired. 8. Kant on beauty in mathematics and science. With Kant's account of beauty now articulated, we can look at the way he handles beauty in mathematics and science. Surprisingly, he denies that there is beauty in either field. In the case of mathematics, Kant writes, it is customary to call the properties of geometrical shapes as well as of numbers beauty, on account of a certain a priori purposiveness, not expected from the simplicity of their construction for all sorts of cognitive use, and to speak of this or that beautiful property of, e.g., a circle. But it is not an aesthetic judgment, judging by means of which we find it purposive, not judging without concept, which makes noticeable a merely subjective purposiveness in this free play of our cognitive faculties, but an intellectual judging in accordance with concepts, which gives us distinct cognition of an objective purposiveness, i.e., serviceability for all sorts of infinitely manifold purposes. One would have to call it a relative perfection rather than a beauty of the mathematical figure. Kant feels compelled to deny beauty in mathematics because, on his account, beauty is supposed to please universally without a concept. Mathematics, by contrast, is entirely conceptual, and we take pleasure in certain conceptual relations that obtain between mathematical entities. Because of this, Kant claims, we can judge mathematics to be good but not beautiful. We can make cognitive, not aesthetic judgments about mathematics. In the case of science, Kant again denies that there is any beauty. He writes that there is no beautiful science, only beautiful art, and oddly attributes the rise of the customary expression beautiful sciences to a verbal confusion, resulting from the realization that advances in sciences spur on the creation of beautiful art. Kant says more about this when he writes about a lack of geniuses in the sciences, where he is explicit that by means of genius, nature does not prescribe the role to science, but to beautiful art. Explaining this, Kant asks us to consider the case of Isaac Newton, writing, everything that Newton expounded in his immortal work on the principles of natural philosophy, no matter how great a mind it took to discover it, can still be learned, but one cannot learn to write inspired poetry. The reason is that Newton could make all the steps that he had to take, from the first elements of geometry to his great and profound discoveries, entirely intuitive, not only to himself, but also to everyone else, and thus set them out for posterity quite determinatively. In the scientific sphere, therefore, the greatest discoverer differs only in degree from the most hardworking imitator and apprentice, whereas he differs in kind from someone who is gifted by nature for beautiful art. In other words, Kant thinks that everything Newton did can be learned, while poetic genius cannot be learned. While genius does not act in accordance with conceptualizable rules, Kant suggests that Newton's science proceeds exactly along these lines, which is why it can be taught. Kant's objections to beauty in science and mathematics has one thing in common. In both cases, what is to be judged beautiful is formulated in terms of abstract concepts, and Kant does not have an account of purely conceptual beauty. Indeed, in all cases of beauty, instances of beauty are expressions of aesthetic ideas, beauty is essentially bound up with intuitions that exceed anything we can possibly conceptualize, thus spurring on the harmonious free play of the imagination and the understanding. However, it is not clear that Kant sees any role for the imagination in mathematics or science. Rather, it seems that Kant sees both disciplines as ultimately rule-based in formulating theories on a wholly conceptual level of the understanding. 2. The romantic response. In the following passage from 1817, just 17 years after the publication of Kant's third critique, chemist and sometime poet Sir Humphrey Davy, eventual president of the Royal Society, writes what reads like a point-for-point challenge to Kant's views on beauty and science, without ever mentioning Kant by name. In the truths of the natural sciences, there is, perhaps, a nearer analogy to the productions of the refined arts. The contemplation of the laws of the universe is connected with an immediate, tranquil exaltation of mind and pure mental enjoyment. The perception of truth is almost as simple a feeling as the perception of beauty, and the genius of Newton, of Shakespeare, of Michelangelo, and of Handel are not very remote in character from each other. Imagination, as well as the reason, is necessary to perfection in the philosophic mind. A rapidity of combination, a power of perceiving analogies, and of comparing them by facts is the creative source of discovery. Discrimination and delicacy of sensation, so important for physical research, are other words for taste, and love of nature is the same passion as love of the magnificent, the sublime, and the beautiful. Against Kant, Davy suggests that the scientist perceives beauty in his grasp of the laws of nature, while Kant would suggest that science is a matter of following rules that does not require the creative power of the imagination. Davy claims the imagination is essential in science. And though Kant claims Newton was not a genius, as geniuses are only in art, Davy insists that Newton was a genius in the same belief as Shakespeare. Davy is said to have had some acquaintance with the doctrines of Kant, and it would not be terribly wild to speculate that this could have been the influence of his good friend, the famed romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In his Biographia Literaria of 1817, Coleridge had written that the writings of the illustrious sage of Königsberg, more than any other work, at once invigorated and disciplined my understanding. The clearness and evidence of among his other works, the Critique of Judgment, took possession of me as with a giant's hand. We can see the extent of the third critique's influence on Coleridge in a passage on the principles of sound criticism, where Coleridge lays out his theory of beauty. The sense of beauty subsists in simultaneous intuitive of the relation of parts, each to each other and all to the whole, exciting an immediate and absolute complacency, without interference, therefore, of any interest, sensual or intellectual. The beautiful is thus at once distinguished both from what is agreeable, which is beneath it, and from the good, which is above it. This appeal to the relation of the parts to the whole is a nod to Kant's notion of purposiveness as it gets developed in the second half of the third critique on teleological judgment. The reference to the disinterested nature of beauty as distinct from the merely sensual, agreeable, and intellectual good is straight out of Kant's triadic distinction at the beginning of the analytic of the beautiful. And yet, while Coleridge seems to adopt a Kantian view of beauty, he prefaces it in a very un-Kantian way. Immediately before the passage quoted above, Kant writes, "The safest definition, then, of beauty, as well as the oldest, is that of Pythagoras, the reduction of many to one." For Coleridge, the Kantian concept of beauty that Kant claimed was not found in mathematics was prefigured by one of the most famous mathematicians who ever lived. Like Davy, Coleridge believes that there are geniuses in science, saying of the young Michael Faraday in 1833, "He seemed to have the true temperament of genius, and carrying on of the spring and freshness of youthful, nay, boyish feelings, into the nurtured strength of manhood." This should not be dismissed as a mere careless use of the word genius, since Coleridge's point about carrying on the freshness of youth into the strength of manhood clearly echoes his own account of genius in his 1817 Biographia Literaria. To contemplate the Ancient of Days and all his works with feelings as fresh as if all had then sprang forth at the first creative fiat characterizes the mind that feels the riddle of the world and may help to unravel it. To carry on the feelings of childhood and the powers of manhood, to combine the child's sense of wonder and novelty with the appearances, which every day for perhaps 40 years had rendered familiar. This is the character and privilege of genius, and one of the marks which distinguish genius from talents. And therefore, it is the primary of genius and the most unequivocal mode of manifestation, so to represent familiar objects as to awaken in the minds of others a kindred feeling concerning them, and that freshness of sensation which is the constant accompaniment of the mental, no less than the bodily, convalescence. While Coleridge's account of genius is much more poetic than Kant's, there are a number of notable similarities. Genius's contemplation of the ancient days, as well as the confirmation that genius contemplates aesthetic ideas of what goes beyond the bounds of experience. Presumably God can work out their aesthetic ideas. And since thought about what lies beyond the bounds of experience engenders antinomies for Kant, it would be fair to say that the one who contemplates such thought feels the riddle of the world. In addition, this feeling for the freshness and novelty of the world, coupled with the capacity to represent this to others, is a proper characterization of the Kantian genius, whose artistic expression is radically original and cannot be anticipated by previous works. This ability of awakening a kindred feeling in the mind of others is like the Kantian doctrine of spirit, the faculty of the mind aroused by the genius that animates the harmonious free play of the faculties and gives us the feeling of disinterested pleasure. Even the idea that we must distinguish genius from talent follows Kant, who claimed in 1785, when I extract other rules from rules that are known, it is talent, but not genius. But when Kant goes on to say, in the same passage, thus Newton was, it is true, a human being of great talent, but not of genius, as he himself said, it is less clear Coleridge would agree. Coleridge does not claim that only artists can be geniuses in this passage, and if he did, it would pose a problem for his claim that Michael Faraday is a genius. While Coleridge agrees extensively with Kant's account of genius, it seems he believes scientists exhibit the characteristics of genius and not just artists. We can strengthen this interpretation by appealing to Coleridge's 1818 to 1819 lectures on philosophy, where he writes, "There is through all nature, and we must assume it as a ground of all reasoning, a perpetual tendency at once to individualize and yet to universalize. There are strong edges in this passage of Kant's claim that the imagination and the understanding are like two friends that constantly harm one another, as the understanding universalizes what the imagination renders concrete. This tension between our representations of the universals and representations of particulars is, for Kant, relieved in the harmonious free play of the faculties of the understanding and imagination, which grounds of disinterested pleasure on which we base our judgments of beauty." Coleridge, too, suggests a way of overcoming the conflict between individualization and universalization in his 1814 journal, The Friend. "It is Shakespeare's peculiar excellence, and throughout the whole of his splendid picture gallery, we find individuality everywhere, mere portrait nowhere. In all his various characters, we still feel ourselves communing with the same human nature, which is everywhere present. We may define the excellence of Shakespeare's method as consisting in that just proportion, that union and interpenetration of the universal and particular, which must everywhere pervade all works of decided genius and true science. What makes Shakespeare's works of decided genius is their ability to communicate a feeling of universality as we feel ourselves communing with the same human nature, despite the individuality of each of the characters. And this mere feeling of universality is perhaps best understood as the feeling of subjective purposiveness and consequent beauty, where we have a mere feeling of an indeterminate concept uniting the sensible manifold we encounter, though there is no determinate concept at work. As Coleridge tells us, such a feeling of universality and particularity must pervade all true science. If the ability to cultivate this feeling is science genius, then it seems Coleridge is committed to true scientist genius, which is perhaps why he called Michael Faraday. 3. An analysis. In the dispute between the Romantics and Kant, there is a large amount of meta-level agreement concerning the nature of beauty and genius. Both link genius to the imagination and the imaginative genius to the creation of beauty. Both connect genius to originality. Both see experiences of beauty as involving a kind of disinterested pleasure. Both claim beauty somehow makes us transcend the domain of experience. Both take beauty to somehow harmonize our capacity for abstraction and our capacity for representing concrete particulars and representations of unity. But despite all this agreement, Kant and the Romantics disagree on whether or not we find these features in science and mathematics, with Kant denying beauty and genius in both domains, and the Romantics affirming beauty and genius in both domains. There are a few criticisms of Kant I think we can raise at this point. First, Kant suggests that we cannot make judgments of beauty in mathematics because our judgments about mathematical truths are not without concept. However, while there is some trivial sense in which this is true, i.e. mathematical truths are conceptual, Kant needs something stronger in this trivial sense. Kant wants to claim that we take pleasure in mathematics because we judge mathematics to be good, which means he needs to show that the only pleasure we take in mathematics is connected with the realization of some end. He suggests such an end when he talks about its serviceability for all sorts of infinitely manifold purposes. Arguably, however, this fails to capture why mathematicians take pleasure in this field of study. In a 1940 book on the aesthetics of mathematics, A Mathematician's Apology, famed English mathematician G.H. Hardy emphasized that mathematics is not directly useful in the same way that, say, chemistry and physiology are. While mathematics may be useful in the long run, Hardy reminds us of the fallacy of supposing that the men whose work most benefits humanity are thinking much of it while they do it. Even if mathematics is ultimately useful, that is not necessarily why the mathematician takes pleasure in it. if Kant wants to show that we only take pleasure in mathematics insofar as we relate it to an end, he will need to give another account that does not rely on mathematics' practical utility. Hardy suggests that the mathematician's patterns, like the painter's or the poet's, must be beautiful. The ideas, like the colors or the words, must fit together in a harmonious way. Beauty is the first test. There is no place in the world for ugly mathematicians. Mathematics. For Kant, judgments of beauty are characterized by being grounded in a feeling of disinterested pleasure. But why can't the mathematician take a disinterested pleasure in mathematical truths? Must all pleasure in mathematics be interested? This point is perhaps debatable, but a mathematician can arguably take pleasure in Goldbach's conjecture that is independent of his desire for its ultimate confirmation. Even if Goldbach's conjecture turned out to be false, one might take pleasure in the mere contemplation of the proposition. Every even integer greater than 2 can be expressed as the sum of 2 primes. What reason could Kant have for denying the possibility of such pleasure? I do not see any. As long as a mathematician can take that kind of pleasure in a mathematical truth, he can pass a judgment of beauty, even if, as will usually be the case perhaps, he will also judge it to be. We will come back to some of the ways Kant can respond later. Until then, we will look at Kant's account of science. First, in response to Kant's claim that there is no beautiful science, an argument parallel to the one above can be given. Even if scientific theories are conceptual, this does not mean that our pleasure in them is based on their relationship to a determinate end. The relevant question is whether or not one can take disinterested pleasure in a scientific theory. Again, it seems very plausible to suggest that one can. Suppose scientist A has proposed a theory and has a vested interest in having it confirmed. Further, suppose scientist B proposed a competing theory that, if true, would undermine A's life's work. Can A take pleasure in the contemplation of B's theory, after bracketing his desire for his own theory to be confirmed? I suspect he can, and if so, this disinterested pleasure can be the ground for a judgment that B's theory is beautiful. Kant's argument that Newton is not a genius, by contrast, hinges on the claim that science is merely a matter of following determinate rules that can be rigorously conceptualized and taught to others. But this claim seems almost certainly false. First, it is not at all clear that when scientists ask good questions, it is merely a matter of following rules. A similar argument could be given if Kant claimed, as he likely would, that mathematics is merely a matter of following rules. As Figner writes, the great mathematician fully, almost ruthlessly, exploits the domains of permissible reasoning and skirts the impermissible. That his recklessness did not lead him into a morass of contradictions is a miracle in itself. Much of the most important work of the scientist and mathematician involves asking the right questions. This is not something that fits Kant's model, which feels an entirely rule-governed. Second, Kant's account seems to eliminate the possibility of anything resembling a paradigm shift, which seems to involve more than just following rules. A paradigm shift has the potential to change the rules themselves. At this point, the romantics seem to have an upper hand in the debate. Against Kant, there is room for creativity and imagination in both mathematics and science, and it may even be necessary for making big breakthroughs in either field. There is room for genius in mathematics and science, and the people we are most likely to identify as genius are precisely the ones who alter the trajectory of the discipline in a profound way, the ones who do not simply follow the rules. In a way, then, it seems that one does not even need to challenge Kant's account of beauty or genius to account for the beauty of mathematics or science. But perhaps this is speaking too fast. If the previous arguments are successful, we have reason to think that it is possible to take disinterested pleasure in mathematical and scientific theories, and this pleasure will be the ground for judgments of beauty concerning such theories. As judgments of beauty, we will demand universal agreement with such judgments. All of this is compatible with the claim that there are no principles of taste by which one can deduce that a mathematical theory or scientific theory is beautiful, a claim that is by no means implausible. However, despite all of these similarities with judgments of beauty, as Kant led out, it is not clear how to understand the pleasure we derive from the contemplation of abstract conceptual theories in terms of the harmonious free play of the imagination and the understanding. This is perhaps most clear if we connect the understanding of the imagination to Kant's doctrine of aesthetic ideas, which engender representations of the imagination so powerful that no concepts are adequate for it. If beautiful objects involve this excess of the imagination over the understanding, we may fear that scientific and mathematical theories cannot be beautiful on Kant's account, insofar as they are wholly conceptual. However, there is another way of reading this result, in which judgments of beauty in science and mathematics are legitimate on Kant's account, even though they do not involve an excess of the imagination over the understanding. We may be inclined to think that judgments of beauty in science and mathematics reveal a problem with the way Kant formulated his account of beauty. Kant seems to think that disinterested pleasure in an object is necessarily linked to the harmonious free play of the imagination and the understanding, in which the imagination is not confined by any determinate cognition. If scientific and mathematical theories are wholly conceptual, and if we can take disinterested pleasure in them, we may think that Kant was wrong to run together these two ideas. Disinterested pleasure may be distinct from the harmonious free play of the imagination and the understanding. Let me end with a final speculative suggestion. Perhaps we are too quick in claiming that beautiful scientific and mathematical theories are wholly conceptual. Wigner claims that the principal emphasis in mathematics is on the invention of concepts. Mathematics would soon run out of interesting theorems. These had to be formulated in terms of concepts which had already appeared in the axioms. We could compare this with this claim with Allison's understanding of the harmonious free play of the imagination and the understanding, in which he claims the imagination in free play stimulates the understanding by occasioning it to entertain fresh conceptual possibilities. On Allison's reading, the imagination seems to spur the understanding into developing new concepts, which Wigner took to be the principal emphasis of mathematics. Davy also realized that characterized the imagination as a creative source, or what sounds like conceptual discovery, when he wrote, "Imagination, as well as reason, is necessary to perfection of the philosophic mind. The rapidity of combination, a power of perceiving analogies, and of comparing them by facts, is the creative source of discovery." Perhaps we can save Kant's doctrine of the harmonious free play of the faculties and judgments of mathematical and scientific beauty if we consider the possibility that the imagination plays a role in making the understanding develop new concepts, leading to new insights and new discoveries. This topic needs to be explored further.